Michael, drunk and arrogant, tore the guardsman's uniform and spat in his face, thinking his money gave him power. But Jackson's reaction shocked everyone. What happened next turned his life into a nightmare. But before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We share the untold stories, secrets, and traditions of the British Guards every day. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The evening in London was especially foggy. The twilight wrapped the ancient buildings in a mist that made them appear even more timeless. Michael, an American tourist, couldn't help but notice how tall, meticulously polished structures loomed above him, their imposing presence undiminished by the night. The chill of the air didn't seem to bother him, though. He was drunk. He could feel the whiskey coursing through his veins, making his steps unsteady and his mind clouded. But it didn't matter. He laughed at nothing, stumbling across the cobbled square, his foot scraping against a marble slab as he went down. Nearby, standing motionless near the statue, was one of the Queen's guards. Jackson was young, strong, and, like most of his fellow soldiers, indifferent to the attention of the passing tourists. His job was simple: maintain discipline and uphold the royal protocol. He didn't care if people stared or tried to provoke him. As long as he kept his composure, everything else was secondary. But tonight, he couldn't help but wonder if the growing number of tourists would cause him any trouble. Michael, despite his unsteady gait, noticed him immediately. Something about the rigid, almost mechanical stance of the soldier caught his attention. An idea bubbled to the surface of his foggy mind. Without thinking, he made his way toward the guard, an impish grin spreading across his face. "Hey, tough guy," he slurred, clearly too intoxicated to notice how inappropriate the situation was. Jackson remained silent, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But Michael wasn't deterred. He took a step closer, reaching out to grab the polished red coat of the guard, pulling at the fabric. "I bet you can't even smile, huh?" he taunted. The moment was frozen in time. Jackson's heart rate quickened, his body tense, but his training kept him still. He couldn't react, not yet. But inside, he felt something stir. He knew this was going to end badly. What happened next was a blur, and for Michael, a moment he would never remember clearly. Whether it was the booze or the rush of defying authority, he couldn't say. But the world around him seemed to fade as his focus narrowed on one thing: the soldier before him, a living target for his misplaced bravado. Before Jackson could process what was happening, Michael yanked harder on the gossamer fabric of the royal uniform, a determined, almost childish tug. The sudden, sharp rip of the cloth cut through the air like a gunshot in the dead of night, echoing across the square. Michael, grinning, held the shredded material up like a trophy, his voice dripping with cruel mockery. "Do you see that?" he sneered, eyes glinting. "You're nothing more than a doll in this silly uniform, nothing but a puppet for the Queen's show." Jackson's mind was spinning, the sheer disrespect rattling him. But then, something deep inside him, a deep, primal instinct, shifted. His grip tightened on the rifle slung across his shoulder. 100 responses surged in his mind, 1,000 ways he could punish this arrogant fool for his insolence. But he stopped. Something darker than anger tugged at him, a voice that told him to wait. The stakes were higher than he realized, and the last thing he needed was this moment to spiral into chaos. He stood rigid, controlled, but his eyes were alive with something far more dangerous than any military training could prepare him for. But Michael wasn't done. In a final, reckless act of drunken rage, he stepped forward, unsteady on his feet, and spat directly into Jackson's face. Time seemed to freeze. The crowd around them, once a quiet murmur of tourists, now fell into a tense silence. The air thickened, charged with a coldness that seeped into every person's bones. Jackson's eyes flared with fury, but he didn't move, not yet. He stood still, a statue of discipline, waiting. And in the distance, the sound of approaching boots signaled the arrival of someone far more powerful, his commanding officer. Moments later, the sound of heavy boots reverberated through the cold night, each step cutting through the tension like a knife. From the sea of stunned onlookers emerged a figure, tall, composed, and radiating an undeniable authority. Captain Wells, Jackson's commanding officer, strode toward the scene. In his late 40s, he was a battle-hardened veteran, a man who had faced horrors few could imagine. His presence alone seemed to change the air around him, and as his piercing eyes scanned the situation, Michael, still drunkenly grinning, felt a sudden unnerving shift. Wells didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. His gaze, cold and calculating, fell on Michael, who remained standing, oblivious to the weight of his actions. Finally, in a voice that was as smooth as it was deadly, Wells spoke. "Do you have any idea who you just insulted?" His words were low, controlled, yet they carried a palpable edge, as if the calmness itself was a warning. Michael blinked, his vision slightly blurred from the alcohol. He squinted at the man before him, sizing him up. "What? Who the hell are you?" He scoffed, his confidence still lingering, though now it felt more hollow than before. Wells closed the distance, his expression unreadable. He could smell the faint traces of whiskey on Michael's breath, but he wasn't interested in that. "This is not some tourist attraction," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've made a grave mistake." Michael's gaze flickered, but he didn't back down. Wells ignored him, turning his attention to Jackson, who still stood rigid, the spit on his face now beginning to dry in the cold evening air. "Go inside, Jackson," Wells commanded. "I'll take it from here." Jackson, his jaw clenched, nodded silently and walked away, his fists balled at his sides, his anger simmering just below the surface. As soon as Jackson disappeared behind the corner, Wells turned back to face Michael, his expression hardening. "You just made your life much harder than it ever had to be," Wells whispered, each word weighed with gravity. "You have no idea what you've done." The silence that followed felt suffocating, the meaning of Wells' words sinking in. Michael's grin faltered for the first time. Michael didn't know it yet, but that night he had unknowingly triggered something far worse than a confrontation with a soldier. The next morning, his life began to unravel. The news spread like wildfire across the city, and soon the incident reached the ears of the royal family. What had started as a drunken prank had escalated into an international scandal. Michael was arrested, dragged through the courts, and plastered across every media outlet, his face now synonymous with disrespect and shame. But the worst was yet to come. Wells, determined to make an example out of him, had used every ounce of influence he had to ensure Michael's downfall. By the time the legal system finished with him, Michael was not only banned from ever entering the UK again, but he had also lost his job, his reputation, and nearly his sanity. As Michael sat in a cold, sterile prison cell in a foreign country, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had never anticipated how a single moment of drunken arrogance could destroy everything he had. In the end, it wasn't the spit or the torn uniform that had done the damage. It was the intervention of Captain Wells, the man who had seen through his facade and made sure that every consequence of his actions was carried out with ruthless precision. In that dark, lonely cell, Michael finally understood the full extent of his mistake. The fall was complete. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and let us know in the comments which guard tradition you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.